Can you tell me what he saw? Here, I'm going to say also what Frederick Brainprof said later on about New Orleans right afterwards, that the New Orleans slave market had a particular dash, and this is in your book.
Yes.
It rejoiced in its display and prosperity. It felt unabashed, almost proud of its slave markets. So from the Sugar Coast into New Orleans, what impact was there?
Okay. All right. So imagine you're coming down the very end of the alluvial valley. When I say alluvial valley, this is just north of Baton Rouge, where there's just enough topography to restrain the river within a valley. Bluffs and terraces no higher than this building. That all disappears after Baton Rouge. That's the old 7,000 years ago, that was the coastline. So in coming into the Deltaic Plain, all of a sudden the land around the river is the highest land around, and water flows away from it. So even in terms of physical geography, everything changes. In terms of agricultural geography, cotton disappears, sugar predominates almost to 100%. Sugar plantations, the architecture of the plantation shifts from more that you would see in the Anglo region of the cotton area, Greek revival, and these styles brought in from the Northeast.
Let's show this.
To these rather West Indian, Caribbean, French Creole style architecture. What you're looking at there are probably about a dozen or a dozen and a half that still stand. Magnificent buildings, beautiful, rather austere architecture, noted for their oftentimes double-pitched hip roofs. Like I said, very West Indian, because New Orleans was really you can almost think of it as the apogee of the Caribbean cultural region. So the architecture would have changed. He would have heard French more and more and English less. He would have been in a more Catholic environment rather than Protestant. And the general geography of the plantations would have been, so you have the highest land right at the riverbank, you have a little dock, and you would see the plantation house, which was not necessarily a mansion. Some of them were rather functional, within about a couple 100 feet of the river. Then the plantation itself would go straight back in a linear pattern, and these are the famous French long lots that you also have in the upper Louisiana country. If you go onto Google Maps and look at the St. Louis area, these very narrow lots radiating out from the river. So you'd have the plantation house, you'd have a number of dependencies, you would have 2 rows of usually whitewashed slave cabins, and then the sugarcane crop going all the way back to the back
How much of this
swamp.
would Lincoln have seen?
Well, on the flatboat, he's almost at river level.
Mm-hmm.
He would have seen a lot more of it from the river returning on the steamboat because he would have been up on the deck. However, because they lingered, they tied up and traded from dock to dock, that he would have been exposed at that micro level.
But he would have, at the wharfs, seen quite a number of slaves there, and
Yes.
close up, and maybe even interacted a bit.
Sure. And upon arriving in New Orleans, they sell the commodities, they disassemble the flatboat. The flatboat wharf is at the upper end of town, as you would expect, because the flatboats are coming from the upcountry. Steamboats were in the middle, and ocean-going ships were at the French Quarter end. That upper end happened to be the more Anglo side of town, and who worked at the flatboat wharves was mostly Irish immigrants. So he would have been exposed to that. When did he get exposed to slave trading up close and personal? Would have been after they finished all their duties and then went exploring in town. And the slave trading was done indoors, and the premier venue, no question about it. There's a number of travelogues who record this for this era. It was called Hewlett's Exchange.
They're out of business now, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were at the corner of St. Louis Street and Charters. The building is now gone, but if you're familiar with it's right by the Napoleon House. Right diagonally across the street is another building of the same era that still stands. And multitudes of eyewitnesses described going. It was almost a tourist attraction.
Well, you can go in many books and find descriptions of what it was like in the slave pens and all of that. But this was really fascinating because you wove it in to where Lincoln, you can just see Lincoln going by and maybe being interestingly seeing what it is, being appalled what it is, whatever it was for him, and it was probably all of that. He certainly saw it up close and personal, I think. So the descriptions of New Orleans when he was there and what he saw are wonderful in here. There's one thing, though, you write about at the slave master's descriptions. Now here's a runaway, as I call it, runaway slave reward broadside that was endemic throughout the United States, actually, with slave masters trying to get back their slaves. And what they do is they say how much they'll be willing to give, and then describe the slave, the runaway slave, as much as possible. Now, you're right that the slave masters wrote descriptions in these reward posters that dehumanized them, as opposed to the auctioneers, who had to emphasize the strengths and capabilities of each of the slaves that they were trying to sell. Yet, when I look at this, I have to admit, I think that these reward posters humanize them as much, if not more, than the auctioneers. They have to show what the slave was like out there in the wild. They're not going to be showing their capabilities or strengths. They're going to exhibit a stutter, or they're going to have a droopy eyelid, or they're going to be whatever. And to me, it almost humanizes them a great deal.
Yeah, it's a good point. And what really struck me about these the runaway ads was these unintentionally sympathetic. This particular one doesn't have it. A little kind of a stock. What would you call it? Like an icon of a runaway fugitive that was.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Those are very popular. You see really more of these. You do see the icons, and those are very desirable because they do have imagery on it.
Right.
And they're usually with a
with
knapsack over
the head looking behind them,
Yes.
and it's a tragic image, and how tone deaf they were that icon would have elicited the exact opposite sympathy that the master was trying to invoke by offering a reward for that person's return.
Let's go to the 1831. We didn't even talk about Allen Gentry. You're going to have to go into this book to see about Allen Gentry, for instance, and his role in Lincoln first coming down the river. But actually, I think if you're going to think of anyone who might have discovered Abraham Lincoln, Denton Offutt is your man.
Yes.
And he discovered him and put him to work in his shop, dry goods shop, and then put him, maybe with himself, on a trip down the Mississippi in 1831. Now, you show a picture in your book of the Shepherd photograph, the first one of Lincoln in a daguerreotype in Washington when he was his congressman. But he's pretty well slicked down.
Right.
He looks pretty good. But if you really want to know the animal, here is a little bit later, but I think this really shows a bit of what he was. John Roll, who helped him make his flatboat that went down, said that Lincoln may have been, quote, the most primitive-looking specimen of humanity, unquote, he had seen. You mentioned this in your book. Caleb Carman said that, also helping, that he was already opposed to slavery, calling it a curse to the land. So those are two insights of him right there in 1831 and what this humanity must have looked like, and Mary fell in love with because of what I think was inside him as much as anything else. So tell us about what this 1831 trip was. What would he have seen differently? He's now in New Salem. He's now in Illinois. So what would he have seen differently?
Right.
What did he know that was different? He certainly built a canoe, knew to do that. Tell us about this.
Okay, well, the 1828 one leaves from Rockport, Indiana. So you're coming down the Ohio, you come to the junction of the future site of Cairo, Illinois, and then you're on the Mississippi. 1831, by this time, the family, the previous year, moves to Illinois, and he starts out from his home just east of Springfield. He and John Johnston, another relative, canoe down to Springfield, where this other great character, Denton Offutt is of the get-rich-quick schemer type. And he had previously arranged to have a flatboat all ready to go, cargo loaded, the men would take it, and they would be off. And they met up with Denton Offutt. They found him in a bar in Springfield. There was only one problem. He forgot the flatboat. So he hired them to build a flatboat. This is just north in some of the congressional timberlands, just north of, and this throws off all their schedules. They finally build it. They float it down to New Salem, and they get caught on the mill dam there. And by the way, if you go to your state capitol, if you look at those murals there, you'll see a depiction of Lincoln getting caught on the mill dam. His ingenuity leads him to dislodge the flatboat. This is really dangerous. If you're caught on the rocks and timber, the flatboat could bend, the caulking could come out, and the whole expedition could be lost. One thing you did not want to do is get your cargo wet, particularly if it was a grain. And so a number of villagers witness Lincoln kind of taking the lead in figuring out how to get it off the mill dam there, and it made a great impression on them. He continues down, so who's on the crew this time? It's Hanks, Lincoln, probably Denton Offutt, and then Johnston. Hanks departs at St. Louis for reasons that are not entirely clear, and they finish the rest of the journey. The timing is remarkably similar. It's also April and returning in June. But second visits are very different from first. That first impression is something and so you come down a second time wiser, a little savvier, and so my sense is that most of the transformative impressions were in the 1828 one. There's one major exception. What's going on in New Orleans in 1831? The talk of the town was an exciting new piece of what was called at the time internal improvements. And this was the Pontchartrain Railroad, the very first railroad. It was horse-drawn at the time, but the locomotive came about a year later. The rails were in place, and this connected the river and the lake. And with certainty, I could place Lincoln in New Orleans at the very time, about 2 weeks after the railroad was inaugurated. Everyone was talking about it. It was the thing to see. Visitors were going to see it. Now, can I say with documented evidence that he saw the railroad? No, but I could put him in the city at that time. He comes back, runs for office for the first time within a year, and two of the major things on his platform is railroads for Illinois and improvements on the Mississippi. Now, where would he have connected those dots? Would have been on
he
this
may have
journey.
been a Jacksonian Democrat, as some say he was, but certainly he took on his Whiggish tone during this period, and the sandbar and the impediments he talked about, and seeing the railroad. And he was a newspaper reader.
Yes.
He would have read newspapers down there. He must have read, or may have read, about the balloon that you talk about, ascent in there. So he looked at internal improvements, looked at technology, and I think all of this was for the mix there in his life.
You have this inquisitive, creative, intellectual mind that's looking for food, and these voyages exposed him to that larger world.
I'm going to go back to a source here. This is Charles Maltby, and he was one of the only New Salem resident who later wrote about Abraham Lincoln. This is now in 1884, and in here now, you talk about how he went down the flatboat with his cargo. When he got to New Orleans, they sold the cargo and then took apart the flatboat and sold that wood, most likely, and then took a steamboat back. Now, here's a source from New Salem of someone who knew Lincoln pretty well. He says here, for a period of 15 months, he had daily intercourse with him in business. So he writes, soon after the arrival of the boats at New Orleans, this is the 31, the cargoes and boats were sold, and a stock of general merchandise was purchased, with which Offutt and Lincoln returned to New Salem. And he talks about a storehouse being built and all that in there. So if this source says that they actually bought more merchandise down there for Offutt's store, how did they get that back up?
Well, they probably presumably would have carried it on the steamboat. The arrangement that flatboatmen had with the steamboats was actually a symbiotic relationship. Steamboats put the keelboats out of business, but they actually benefited the flatboat trade in that now flatboatmen had this economic and rapid way to get home. So the deal they worked out with the steamboatmen was, or the captains, was that they would either get a reduced fare or travel for free. They would sleep out on the deck and they would run errands. The steamboat would stop, the flatboatman would run off, get the wood to keep the engines going, water, supplies, and so they would come home for a greatly reduced fare. So presumably any sort of merchandise there would have been brought back with them.
I'm just going to thank some of those who have purchased books already, and we appreciate this because purchase of these books not only builds a good library and good reading for yourself, but allows us to bring in authors such as Rich.